So typically when we're talking about sterilization, we're looking at the 6 log. So we're looking about 99.9999% log reduction. And that's what we're looking for with the sterilization. That's essentially 1 in a million. So if there are a million colony forming units of spores on this spore strip, then you have a 1 in a million chance that the one would be left over at the end.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
On this week's episode of Beyond Clean, we're talking to Adam Okada, Clinical Education Specialist at the Healthmark Industries. And Bobby, Adam's not a new name or face in the sterile processing industry, and he's not even a new name or face to Beyond Clean. This is kind of a reunion episode, getting Adam back over into the Beyond Clean studio today, talking about a huge, important topic in the sterile processing space, the topic of BIs.
Yeah, it'll be really good to talk to Adam again. And I can't think of anybody better to bring on the show to talk about this particular topic. Adam's pretty well read, so I think we're going to get to grill him a little bit on this one because it's a deep topic for sure, but I know he's up for the challenge.
All right. Well, if you tuned in, it's because you want to know about BIs. You don't want to hear from me and Bobby. So hang with us here for just a couple of moments, and we'll be right back with Adam Okada and BIs.
I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Walsh.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And joining us now on Beyond Clean is Adam Okada, Clinical Education Specialist at Healthmark Industries. Adam, I told you right before we came on that I missed you, and I meant it. I miss you, man. It's good catching up. How you been?
I've been good. I miss you guys too. It's always fun to be back on Beyond Clean.
Yeah. So I know we're going to have some listeners who may be like, what are they talking about? Because you may be new listeners. But a couple years ago, Adam was on the Beyond Clean team doing some great content education, doing a lot of stuff through the YouTube channel. So we grew a lot during Adam's time. We're still keeping that YouTube going. So I hope you're proud of us there, Adam.
Awesome. Absolutely.
And I reached out to Adam specifically on this topic of BIs, biologicals, because I wanted to talk to someone who had been on both sides, the clinical education side of it and the user side of it, to really bring that insight together. So I'm really excited to get you back in the studio with us. So let's set the stage. We're going to have brand new students listening to the show. We're going to have new technicians, maybe just into the industry. We're going to have some old hands who, they think they know everything there is to know about BI. So I hope we're going to have something of value for everybody on that spectrum. But before we get into the complex, let's start at the simple. What are we talking about when we say BIs?
So at a basic level, biologicals have living spores inside them, and they're usually made from the type of spore that's going to be very resistant to the sterilization method that we're using. So we use them to verify our sterilizer is working, because if it can kill those spores, then we have a reasonable assurance that any other microorganisms that might be on those instruments will also be destroyed in that process.
Spores. Okay. So I'm going to give you, this is your first opportunity to show off, man. So I hope you're ready. Hope you did your tongue-tied twister here before. So what is that spore for STEAM BIs that everyone, as they're studying for certification, this is the big thing to remember. What is this spore called?
Geobacillus stereothermophilus.
I love it, man. Killed it. Softball.
Yeah, nobody can say I don't do research before I come here. So
Love it. Yeah. So as you alluded to, spores, right? So that's one of the hardest things out there to kill. That's the challenge piece. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here when we talk about how these things work. But yeah, the why behind them. What are the different reasons, and maybe more than one, right? Like, what's the why that this in our sterile processing day to day, everybody in the United States, if you're processing instruments, you've been confronted with using BIs. Why is that the case?
Well, essentially, you have to think about what sterilization is. And sterilization is a biocidal process. It's meant to kill or inactivate living microorganisms that might be on instrumentation. That's how we make them safe for patients. And then it also helps to know Spalding and the Spalding classification scale to know the difference between sterilization and high-level disinfection. So while high-level disinfection kills most microorganisms, it does not kill all spores. Sterilization does inactivate all microorganisms, including spores. And so that's why we use spores inside our biologicals. And we talked about that Geobacillus stereothermophilus for steam and hydrogen peroxide sterilization, because that's a spore it's hardy, it's heat resistant, and thus it's very difficult for us to kill. So if our sterilizer can kill those spores and they don't grow once they're in the growth media, then we know our sterilizer and our biocidal process is working as it should be. There was actually a book, I'm trying to think of the name of it right now, Biological Indicators for Sterilization Processes. I want to say that's the title. And the introduction in that book, it actually has this quote: the purpose of a sterilization process is to inactivate microorganisms. Therefore, we need to verify that the sterilization process is effective at inactivating microorganisms. And I think that's the main takeaway of why we need to use them.
That's a really good summary and highlights for us that we're working with worst possible scenarios, right? We're picking spores that are difficult to kill and giving us that reasonable assurance. You said that if we can sterilize this, we can sterilize anything in the load. So I imagine, and I'm familiar, that the sterile processing department doesn't get to just decide willy-nilly what BI they're going to use and on what cycle, if they want to use it or not. So why don't you tell us a little bit about those guidelines and standards that govern the decision on when to use these and what kind of BIs to use?
Yeah, absolutely. So it has to do with the AAMI standards. Typically in SPD, we all follow AAMI. And in ST79, which is all about steam sterilization, there's a section all about biological indicators. And in there it talks about, why we use Geobacillus stereothermophilus, the frequency of how often we need to test it. And in there it states that the biological indicators are the only sterilization process monitoring devices that provide a direct measure of the lethality of the process. If we think about indicators, those are in the presence of one form. So like if it's in a steam and it's an indicator, it'll get hot and then it'll change color. But this is really the only way that we can actually prove that our machines are working. There are other groups with AAMI. Like I know there is a biological indicators group. I think they mostly deal with ISO, not so much the standards here in the US, but there are a lot of standards that talk about biologicals. But I think AAMI is the one that people go to because it's specifically about steam sterilization.
Yeah, and so as you reference those AAMI guidelines specifically, are there any particular cycles that a sterile processing department should be using biological indicators on? Like how frequently, and are all cycles created equal in that regard?
So people think that you have to do it every day, which is kind of false. According to the standards, in a steam sterilizer, you should be using a biological with a process challenge device at least weekly, preferably daily. And then, of course, there are cycles that you would need to test. Like anytime you have an implant load, you should have a process challenge device with that. And when you're testing, you want to test on different cycles. So if you have a gravity cycle, you should test that as well as testing pre-vacuum cycles. So it can go a lot more in depth than that because like ETO, you have to test every load because usually you only run once per day. But with biologicals, typically that's what we're talking about with steam.
So, Adam, I wanted to talk about defining that process challenge device, that PCD that you mentioned. Before we get into that, I don't want to leave the spore conversation just yet. So there's one more spore out there that's maybe less known than our favorite Geobacillus stereothermophilus. And just FYI, we got a t-shirt coming out through Beyond Clean that's going to be Saint Stereothermophilus, the patron saint of sterile processing. So be on the lookout for that on our Amazon store. But yeah, what's that other spore that you may interact with in this BI discussion in sterile processing?
Yeah, so Geobacillus erythromatophilus is used for steam sterilization. It's used for hydrogen peroxide and ozone, but typically they use Bacillus atrophaeus in ETO because that's the spore that's hardest to kill with that method.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So, that one is not as important to know for the certification exams, right? But it is a nice trivia if you want to really wow your student, to throw that one out there maybe for a bonus question. Yeah. So, PCD, we've talked about this on the show before, but this is one that can kind of get a little confusing because a PCD is not a BI, but there's a relationship between the two. So kind of untangle that for us real quick, if you will.
Yeah, so PCD, a process challenge device, is essentially something you're using to put the biological inside to ensure that it can go through, say, a rigid container or a wrapped item, your barrier packaging. So you just want to make sure that that PCD is there to challenge the sterilizer. It can get through the package and actually kill the BI and everything that's inside, similar to how we wanted the instruments inside of our trays to be sterilized.
Right. Okay. In kind of describing these BIs, podcasts are always fun because we don't have any visuals with us. If you were trying to tell someone who had never seen a BI before what it actually looks like, how are you going to describe this little device?
It's funny because I am actually old enough to remember the days before self-contained BIs where we actually had these spore strips that were separate and we would have to peel pouch them, seal it, run it in the sterilizer. And then at the end of the cycle, we had little pinchers. We would take out the spore strip. We'd put it into the vial of growth media, and then we'd actually incubate it into the machine, for 48 hours. I remember that was the one that we had. And then at the end of that 48 hours, we had to visually look at it and determine whether or not the spores had grown. So if you fast forward now to today, the self-contained BI is essentially everything's the same. The spore strip, growth media, it's in a vial, but now it's all in one. It requires a lot less work for us. But that's typically, if we were talking about deconstructing one of your self-contained BIs, that's essentially what it is. There's more to it, but yeah.
So when you say a vial, are these plastic? Are they glass? Because vial kind of sounds like glass. Ampule, I don't know if those are the same kind of words or not, but combination. And are they all the same between manufacturers, or are there some kind of different designs out there?
I mean, the spore is typically going to be the same because you're wanting to test the sterilizer in the similar kind of way, but obviously they're going to be made of different materials. A lot of them have these kind of fluorescent dyes, or they have a way to mark the enzymes inside of the packaging. So now they will actually glow. That's where you see that color change that happens so rapidly. It's because the enzymes are actually growing and they have these kind of fluorescent marking on them. Everyone's going to have kind of a different proprietary technology as far as that's concerned. I'm sure some people might hear dye and think, our BI doesn't use a dye or whatever it is. But typically, they're all going to be in a very similar design where they have the same kind of spore. It's going to be in some type of vial or ampule, and then it's got to get introduced into the growth media to show that color change.
I don't know why, Adam, but when you said our BI doesn't have a dye, it made me think of all those claims about organic baby foods and things like that, say for ingesting and don't eat your biological indicators. But it does bring up a really interesting practical question in the sterile processing department. Everybody gets a little weirded out about these BIs and what to do with them when we're done with them because there's live bacterial spores in them. So what's your advice on, how to dispose of those, how to handle them? Is it safe to handle one with your hands? What are your thoughts on that?
I would reference the manufacturer IFUs because they're all going to be a little bit different as far as that's concerned. Some will have to have gloves on as you're essentially cracking the BI or whatever. And then same thing for disposal. Sometimes they'll say you have to have gloves on when you're disposing of them and to put them in a biohazard trash. So every IFU, again, is going to be a little bit different. Just know Geobacillus erythromatophilus is not something that's going to make you incredibly sick if you were to accidentally get exposed to it or anything. Obviously, if you do get exposed, you want to make sure you go to your safety data sheets and those kinds of things. But it's relatively safe spore in that it's not going to cause a lot of disease or cause a lot of, bad things to happen. But I would refer to the manufacturer IFU as far as disposals.
This guy with the IFUs. Who invited this IFU guy?
I know, right?
The great insight. We can't say that enough. I know it's interesting in the industry because we constantly push back to IFU so many times that, folks are okay, the IFUs again. But, it's important to have robust IFUs that actually give you instruction, right, for things, because this is not that question about disposing of the BI after use. That's not the primary function of the BI. It's the test. It's the running it appropriately, compliantly, and everything else. But then you got this little bitty point at the end. And then all the users have the questions about it. They're like, yeah, but now what do I do with it? And then you go back to IFU again and you're like, oh yeah, I never even got down to that section about proper disposal. And there is a section there. So yeah, that's a great call out. Let's go back here to how these BIs work. And you mentioned the term lethality. Love that word. How long does it take to kill these little buggers?
So to kill the spores, I mean, we could go real deep into the science. I don't think we want to get that deep into it. It's going to have to do with like log reduction and D values and things like that. Just real briefly, log reduction, essentially, let's say you have log 0, that's 0%, or the 0 microorganisms are getting killed. If you have log 1, that's 90%. Log 2 is 99. And the D value means you're just moving that decimal place over 1. So typically when we're talking about sterilization, we're looking the 6 log. So we're looking about 99.9999% log reduction. And that's what we're looking for with the sterilization. That's essentially 1 in a million. So if there are a million colony forming units of spores on this spore strip, then you have a 1 in a million chance that the one would be left over at the end. So, I mean, but that's typically what we're talking about with the lethality inside the sterilization is we're going that log value and we're going more and more. We're trying to get to that end percentage of getting all of them killed.
Because as you kind of alluded to, and I guess maybe has come up a couple times already, there's no guarantee of sterility. There's based on everything we know about science, about sterility, about the test and everything, this has given us our best possible chance, that sterility assurance, that you can dang well bet your life on it, because we bet our patient's life on it, but there's no way to prove it just because of the dynamics of, keeping something sterile while also testing it, etc. So that's kind of why we're in that scenario. But I did have a question around the timing functions of these BIs. Obviously, a lot of marketing ink is spilled on promoting the newest innovation of BIs, and a lot of this is around speed. What are your thoughts, or what, should users know about the speed and these read times? What's important about that? Maybe what's not important about that? I don't know. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, the idea behind the speed thing, I think, is just to make it more convenient for us, right? Everybody wants it to be a faster read time. I feel like we've gotten to the point now where you can't even really release the load until it's cooled down. So the cooling time actually takes longer than our biologicals. So we're kind of at the point now where kind of leaving them in the incubator for 20 to 30 minutes isn't going to be a big deal. If we go to 15 or 10 or whatever it's going to be, it's really not going to help us because the lab still has to cool. So, but typically there is a little bit of debate, right? Because if you have these very quick read times where essentially it's looking for any identification of that fluorescent light or that UV light that it's looking for, you could potentially get false positives or, false negatives because it's seeing something or not seeing something that isn't actually there yet. And so that's where, I know a lot of manufacturers will have things in their IFU like, don't use this with a lot label, because sometimes the adhesive from the lot label can get into the machines and then can cause false positives to happen. So, I mean, that's the danger with getting this technology to be so, sensitive, I guess, that it's starting to sense any little change or any little, dot of light, and then it's going to go positive. So I think that's probably going to be the danger there if we get to that point. But typically the technology is pretty solid, and we don't see a lot of those false negatives, false positives, or anything like that anymore.
So, Adam, you've been dropping some knowledge bombs on us, talking about Geobacillus stereothermophilus, PCDs, log reductions, all of this. So you're telling us how to get it right. But just in your experience in the sterile processing world, what are some of those common misunderstandings where people might make a misstep about BIs?
I think, the biggest one that I think is a misconception about, and it actually has probably more to do with the chemical indicators, is I'll go to my students and I'll show them a tray and I'll say, how do you know that this is sterile? And they'll say, well, it's sterile because the tape on the outside or because the indicator has changed color. That's not really proof of sterility. So you really have to kind of understand how the sterilizer works, how to understand how this, that spore kill and everything like that to understand that the biological is our best evidence that a load is actually sterile. It's that physical, if it can physically kill those spores, then we know it can kill most other things, or just about everything else other than prions, but we'll get into that. So the BI is kind of that, proof thing. And I think that's one of the bigger misconceptions in the industry.
No, that's spot on. And part of the chief reason for that is that biological indicator has no idea if you did your job in decontam right with those instruments, right? So all I can tell you is that we've hit the right parameters to achieve sterilization in here, but what's actually going on that mosquito forceps right next to the biological, that's up to the whole process and not just what that biological indicator did. So I appreciate you bringing that up, particularly around this. As our sterilization cycle is finished and we're getting this BI out that doesn't necessarily tell us if the instruments are sterile, but gives us that degree of sterility, how do you go about incubating and reading that? And what particular challenges or difficulties might a department run into in keeping that documentation and keeping those results interpreted properly?
It's funny because I feel like the technology that we have has evolved to the point where it's not so much it's trying to take out the human error. I feel like that's where a lot of these self-contained BIs, the auto readers, or the way that we have all this technology now, it's meant to take a lot of our mistakes out of that process. So I remember once when we used to have to calibrate. I don't know if you guys remember, we used to have to calibrate our readers and put in like a positive and make sure that it was calibrated that this is a positive and then the negative one should be negative. But we actually had a situation where we had a negative BI that was used as the calibration. So everything was coming negative. Even the controls that had clearly turned yellow visually, everything was turning negative on the machine. And we didn't realize that it was calibrated wrong until 2 days later. Now, somebody should have realized it sooner than that. But I mean, that's kind of the issues that you see in the industry. It's more having to do with the human error side of it. And again, not following the IFUs. Some of them have certain kinds of ink. So we want to mark our BIs. We want to know what load it came from. But some manufacturers don't like you to have the lot label on the actual BI. Some of them you have to have a certain type of ink that you're writing on them with. And those are all kind of things that can happen with our BIs where we see issues, false positives, negatives, and things like that.
Sure. And as you talked about calibrating and documenting that calibration to make sure that our incubator is working correctly, the BIs are all right, could you maybe give us the elevator pitch for what kind of documentation our departments need to be keeping for the biological indicators as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we need to have the lot number, and the lot number has to match the control. So, essentially, you want to make sure you have a batch of good biologicals where the spores are alive, and that's why we have that control there. The control there is there to show that, yes, there are live spores in this lot. And then when that turns positive, we know that that's, they're alive. Then when it goes in the sterilizer and it kills them, then it's showing up negative on our reader. So we have to document that lot number. That's incredibly important to show that that lot is good. You obviously have to make sure that if it's an implant load, you're making sure that you have that PCD and you've shown that you've run it with it. And then the documentation, pass, fail. So again, lot numbers, pass, fail, all the results and everything. It becomes a little easier now, especially if you have readers that are connected to our tracking systems. But I was at a hospital not that long ago that did not have a tracking system, and all of that's paperwork, and you have to make sure that all that documentation is good. So there is a lot of documentation. Remember those legal documents too. You can't just say it was negative, even if it came up positive, just because you want to move on with your day. If something happens, you better make sure you document that something happened.
So, Adam, you've brought up control a couple of times and you've explained it pretty well, but I just want to take one more step back and clarify what's different in the treatment of the control versus how we treat the other biologicals that we're doing the tests on.
So the control is essentially just proving that there are live BIs inside. And again, when you're processing the control, you want to follow the IFUs. A lot of times it will say to use gloves when you're cracking the BIs and things like that. But the control is just that proof that those are alive inside, so that when it kills or has that, inactivation later with our biologicals inside the sterilizer, we have that sort of reference point that we know they were alive here. And now we showed that they were not alive in this test.
And so the control, just to kind of spell it out, it comes out of the package, it's cracked, and it goes right into the incubator, does not pass through the sterilizer. Okay.
Correct. Sorry. Yes. Adam,
Yeah,
yes. Very basic level. That's absolutely yes. Sorry about that.
Great. No. That's fine. But it's easy to be confused, especially when you start talking about, pluses and minuses in that whole dynamic of like, is the control supposed to be plus or minus? If something passes, well, it's a minus, but like everybody kind of grows up. Like if you pass, you want a plus, right? That's the good.
Exactly.
In this scenario, the negative is the good and the plus is the bad, unless you're talking about the control. We gotta really need to level set that, especially for new students and technicians, because it's easy to get in over your head because of all the numbers, all the lots and everything that you were just referencing. So
yeah, as a student myself, that was one of the hardest things to like get in my head was like, okay, negative, good, positive, bad. If there's a positive result, that means something's wrong. We need to try to fix it. So that was hard as a student to kind of get used to that.
Yeah. No, that's terrific. Well, one of the other very important training questions here to call out is placement in the load. So can you just speak to, when you're dealing with BI tests, what should you be thinking as you're placing that in that sterilization load?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but you have to go to the IFUs for the BIs to say, where in the machine it's supposed to be. The manufacturer, because in low temp, sometimes it's different. Sometimes it's on the top shelf, not on the bottom. Whereas in steam, you usually want it over the drain, whether the drain is in the front of the rack or it's in the middle of the walk-in ones. So it's going to be placed differently depending on your sterilizer, depending on what BI you're using. But typically, you want it over the drain in steam sterilizers. I think primarily we're dealing with steam sterilization. For low temp, you just have to follow what the IFU says for the manufacturer.
In your training on the clinical education side out there in the field around BIs, the majority of it's obviously geared towards sterile processing users because we own this process for the most part. But obviously there's going to be some OR training that's involved. So can you speak to like, what are those highlights or what are the concerns that you always like to bring up when you're talking to OR folks as opposed to SPD? Like, what should they know? What do we all wish they would know about BIs that they don't know? And lay that out, for folks who maybe have not communicated that education up the chain yet.
Yeah, so I've seen a BIs run in a million wrong ways. I've seen them run on their side. I've seen them run upside down. I've seen them run underneath a tray. And typically it's just lack of understanding of what it is. And then people don't understand how important it is to do it the right way. You're wanting to test this sterilizer to ensure that there's lethality in that machine. You don't want to run it wrong because if they have positives and things like that, you have to take the machine down. So when you talk about OR training or things like that, a lot of times they're involved in the IUSS process and have those sterilizers up in the OR. Typically, I would start with the why behind it. What is the biological at a very basic level? We talked about that earlier. Why is it so important to run it correctly? Because you want to make sure that our sterilizers are working. And then I think it gives them a little bit more understanding of the process so that they'll then try to do it a little more effectively. But usually that's the misconception. It's not somebody that was never shown how to do it right. It's just somebody who doesn't understand why it's so important to do it the way it is in the IFU, according to your machine, according to your BI. So I think that would be the first place I would start with the OR.
Adam, you can tell that you spent a good time as an educator and teaching, because understanding the why and having that reinforce what we're doing in the department so they know the reasons and know the right way to do it, that is the way to live. So I appreciate you bringing that out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Earlier in the interview, you referenced the minimum number of cycles that we need to run biological indicators on and calling out that weekly, preferably daily, and always with implants. And there's a trend in the industry right now moving towards monitoring every sterilization cycle just because we get that high degree of sterility assurance. But even with that, as we look to the future, what kind of new technology or trends do you think might be coming down in the future related to biological indicators?
I mean, I think they're probably going to try to continue to make them faster. I think that's something that's very popular. And it seems like it's always on the
read.
Yeah, exactly. The faster you can go, the more you can put that in your marketing materials and people are going to be attracted to it. But I think that as technology has evolved, it's really gone in the direction of taking the human part out of it so that we don't make as many mistakes. In the old days, when biologicals were first introduced, it was basically a laboratory process. You had spore strips. They actually had to get a way to take to the laboratory. They would do the testing there at the lab, and then they would send you the results. And Obviously, there was a lot of human error involved in that. If the spore strips weren't handled correctly, if they weren't transported correctly, a lot of things could go wrong and contaminate samples in that way. So we've gotten to the point now where it's all in a self-contained little thing. We have the crackers or whatever we have in the machines to help us like break them and introduce the growth media to the spore strips. All of that is really to take the human error out. I think we're probably going to continue to see that trend where it's just going to be a little bit easier for us to do these tests and a little bit harder for us to make mistakes and get those false results as they do cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, well, human error is all across healthcare, definitely in sterile processing. That is the leading cause of error out there. Did you plug it in? And if you did, what else did you miss in the process? So, that's a good highlight. And anything that we can do to innovate, that human error out of that, I think is a good move. So, hey, terrific conversation, Adam. I got a feeling there may be some more BI questions after the show. How can folks reach out to you directly if they want to continue the conversation with you?
Hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm on there, Adam Okada, and then my email, aokada@hmark.com. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer them.
All right. Well, Adam, I really appreciate you coming back on the show and the platform today, and looking forward to talking to you again soon.
You know what? I'm going to be like Steve Martin on SNL. Anytime you call, I'll show up. I'll be here.
Sounds good, brother. And that was Adam Okada, Clinical Education Specialist at Healthmark Industries. Every time we talk to Adam, Bobby, it's a breath of fresh air. This guy's passionate, he's bright, he's engaged with what's going on. And he likes to remind us that he's been around the industry for a while. I thought for a second he was going to say, and I walked uphill both ways to my sterile processing department every day. I'm not just kind of kidding about that, but he's seen the trends, which is what's so fun to talk to a guy like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I personally am thankful for the self-contained BIs. That passing the strip over into the growth media does not sound like a fun way to go.
Yeah, the reference, he brought up the IFUs, the importance of IFUs, and I know I kind of poked a little bit of fun at him, but we are huge fans of IFUs at Beyond Clean. Just in case anyone's listening and try to write us a letter, no, we do like IFUs, and it's critically important, especially things as complex as BIs, to know what your IFUs say. I would say a good practice for new technicians before you let them off orientation, sit them down, pull that IFU for your BIs and have them read through it. And maybe even highlight anywhere that's kind of confusing, because those are big IFUs. Like you're talking about a little fold out sheet, like folded like 100 million times in this little square. And then you pull it out and it's like a big like road map from back in the day when we had real maps. And now I'm the old one. But, sit them down in the training, go through those IFUs and really pinpoint the confusion around the IFUs for every stage of handling these BIs, even to the point of disposal. You may be surprised at the gaps in understanding you have from these new technicians. And then you get the opportunity to fill up the gap before you let them off into the real world of working independently in your department. All right, that's going to do it for this episode all about consumables. Thank you again for tuning in, and remind you, as we always do here at Beyond Clean, to keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.